is Boštjan Nedoh. Boštjan is a research associate at the Institute of Philosophy here. Boštjan has published extensively, both in Slovenia and internationally. He's the author of the book Ontology and Perversion. He's the co-editor of the volume Lacanian a disjunctive synthesis. And Boštjan is currently working on a book on anxiety, ontology, and sexual difference. And I think the material you're presenting today is quite related to that topic. The title of the presentation is Anxiety and Ontology Towards a Lacanian Materialist Metapsychology of Affect. Thank you, Boštjan.
Well, thanks, Lorenzo, for this kind introduction, and thanks you and, well, today and other colleagues from the Institute and the University of Newcastle to putting together this conference, which is appearing to be really, really great event. Like a lot of new thoughts and a lot of material, a lot of food for thought during yesterday and today, so it's pretty entertaining and interesting so far. Maybe like we end previous lecture delivered from today with missing last question. And so maybe I'll take the chance to start precisely at this point, because what is going to hear is going to resonate very much with today's one of today's theses. So that there has to be in the analysis somewhere a kind of material support for metapsychological insights. And to cut a long story short and to anticipate a bit what the main overarching point I'm trying to make both in the book and in this particular lecture is that anxiety functions as a material signal, material affect that gives a kind of royal access to metapsychological dimension of the dead drive. But I'll try to make that conclusion in the end of this presentation. So it's going to be one installment, a bit simplistic and general in the beginning, and then in the second part I will try to make well, yeah, a more concrete case for the link between anxiety and ontology in the realm of psychoanalysis. So yeah, like I said, let me begin with kind of a bit simplistic view of the general problem in which I'm trying to inscribe my argument of the relation between anxiety and ontology. So in the history of modern philosophy, affects in general, and particularly the affect of anxiety, has experienced a rather peculiar and uneasy fate. In fact, after the Cartesian dualism of mind and body, of reason and senses, so after this dualism gained hegemony, the question of affects as something categorically different from both mind and reason was somehow repressed or excluded from philosophical engagement. Okay, there are some currents that try to deal with affects, but well, yeah, considering this division, the philosophy mainly dealt with the side of reason, not to that of senses and affects. And on the very general and level, so yeah, the first current that systematically tried to engage with the problem of affects was post-Schellingian Kierkegaardian existentialist philosophy dealing with affects of boredom, anxiety, despair, and so on and so on. So what we have at first glance, it's a counter, it's an opposition between like Kierkegaardian existentialist philosophy and first rationalist current, then developed, then follow up by German idealism on the other side. But as Michael O'Neill Burns, for example, argued in his pretty important book, in my view, Kierkegaard and the Matter of Philosophy, A Fractured Dialectics, this popular picture according to which Kierkegaardian subjective existence is opposed to the mechanic totality of the dialectical system and to the seemingly irresistible progress of objective spirit is in many ways obviously misleading, to say the least. In fact, against rather this naive picture of existence versus system, O'Neill Burns instead argues that the whole Kierkegaard's existentialist philosophy emerges at the point of what he calls fractured dialectics. That is, not as an external critic of German idealism, as is usually assumed, but as an immanent and thus materialist critic addressing malfunctions and fractures within the system, rather than its smooth functioning. Accordingly, the fracture, the break, the crack is immanent to the system, and subjective existence is related to this point of systemic failure and is, in some sense, even produced by it. In short, for Kierkegaard, man is spirit, yet spirit that failed to reconcile or resolve itself via synthesis, so resolve its inner contradictions. Now, this insight immediately sheds new light on a general relation between affects and reason, and ultimately also between affects and ontology. Even if one conceives of affects in a reductive manner by reducing themselves exclusively to the domain of the subjective and subjectivity, the blurring of the distance between subjective and objective puts a huge question mark above this conception of the opposition between subjective affects and objective spirit. In fact, this inner intertwining between subjective and objective brings the problem of affects, including the affects of anxiety, which is, like I said, the primary concern in this paper, closer to the questions of ontology than one might assume. Incidentally, already Kierkegaard himself introduced in his concept of anxiety a crucial distinction between, on the one side, subjective anxiety, which is anxiety of an individual sinner, and objective anxiety, which, as he puts it, is the reflection of a sinfulness of the generation in the whole world, therefore the effect of a sin in a non-human existence. That's what was a quote from Kierkegaard's concepts of anxiety. Here, objective anxiety immediately relates, so the concept of objective anxiety immediately relates anxiety to the ontological determinations of the world, and specifically as O'Neill Burns puts it, to its inner fractured dialectics or gap. Not surprisingly, Lacan places his articulation of anxiety and the whole conceptual framework of the Seminar 10 anxiety precisely at the point of this short circuit between dialectics itself, that is, on the non-dialectical rather than anti-dialectical gap within the system. More specifically, as he points out in the introductory lecture of the failed seminar on the names of the father, which follows the Seminar 10 on anxiety, what happens in Seminar 10 on anxiety is a kind of shift from Hegel to Kierkegaard, from system to its inherent gap, whereby anxiety as a sole affect, which, quote-unquote, does not deceive, figures as a privileged access to the structure of this very same gap. There is a short quote from Lacan from the names of the father. It is here that anxiety is for us a sign, as was immediately seen by the contemporary of the development of Hegel's system, which was at that time quite simply the system with capital S, as was seen, sung, and marked by Kierkegaard. Anxiety is for us witness to an essential gap onto which I bring testimony that Freudian doctrine is that which illuminates. End of quote. So, however, despite Kierkegaard, and to be sure, before him already Schelling, brings affects and ontology into close proximity, and although Freudian Lacanian psychoanalysis seems to represent a continuity with Kierkegaard, there nevertheless remain some crucial differences between anxiety as an existentialist affect and the way psychoanalysis deal with the very same concept. To highlight only a couple of most crucial short circuits in Kierkegaard's take on anxiety from the psychoanalytic point of view, there is, on the one hand, the short circuit between anxiety as the affect to be felt and anxiety as the object of thought, so the concept, whereby the two are in principle mutually exclusive. On the other hand, this leads us to another short circuit which refers to as yet unclear conceptual distinction between senses and affects in general, and particularly between the affect of anxiety and the sense of fear, for example, which is one pretty crucial in Freudian Lacanian psychoanalysis. Well, this distinction, which is crucial between anxiety and fear, it's far from being unrelated to the problem of ontology. In fact, while for both Kierkegaard and even more so for Heidegger, anxiety reveals nothingness as an existential condition surrounding a particular existence, the famous nothingness as a determination of design, for Freud and Lacan, anxiety precisely in its ontological form, invoked by Lacan already in his early essay, The Logical Time. The exact phrase is ontological form of anxiety, which implies a sharp distinction between anxiety and fear, is articulated as an immanent moment in the process of the constitution of subjectivity, and not simply as its external condition of possibility. In short, Lacan's infamous reversal of the existentialist and phenomenological conception of anxiety as a lack of object, as a privation of the object, which he unfolds in his seminar 10, along with the thesis that, quote unquote, as we all know, anxiety is not without the object, leads not only to a completely new definition of the object as objectia, with respect to the previous phase of Lacan's teaching, as, for example, Jacques-Alain Miller argued, and characterized in this way the main achievement of Seminar 10, but also has far-reaching consequences for the articulation of Lacan's own critique of classical ontology, or better yet, his critical ontology, because I'm more and more convinced that Lacanian criticism of ontology does not lead to any kind of rejection of ontology, but to, well, to put it in the way he puts the relation between science and psychoanalysis, asking the question, what would science be that included psychoanalysis? We could ask the same question regarding, which is more or less a rhetorical one, regarding the ontology. What would ontology be if included psychoanalysis? So to summarize what follows, my argument will be that Lacanian anxiety, famously conceived as a signal of the real, is inextricably connected with, I would try to call, the third dimension of being, which amounts to what Lacan in Seminar 11 labeled as the unrealized. That is to say, to the peculiar structure of the unconscious, which distorts the classical opposition between being and non-being. For Lacan, the unconscious, rather than referring simply to the repressed unconscious content, is instead structured around a pre-ontological gap or ontological negativity, to borrow the term advanced by Alenka Zupancic. While for Lacan, anxiety notoriously does not deceive, it does not deceive only regarding the subject's encounter with the real, operating as a signal for this encounter, but also, and most importantly, regarding the specific ontological structure of the unconscious, without which there cannot be anything similar to the Lacanian real, and consequently, neither something like the affect of anxiety. In other words, the affect of anxiety, as different from fear, emerges as an affective correlate, supplement, of the structure of the unconscious, which includes the ontological negativity or real, whereby anxiety, in turn, figures also as a privileged access to this very same structure. In this respect, anxiety might be regarded as an ontological affect, indeed not in a post-humanist sense of an affect of being or matter, but rather as an affective correlate or material sign, signal, whatever you want to call it, of the fracture of the being itself. Importantly, without this specific ontological gap, negativity, void, which is materialized by object small a, as both the object of the drive and the object cause of desire, there would be only probably fear and frustration and not anything like anxiety. And last but not least, such an inextricable connection between anxiety and negativity brings anxiety into the domain of the metapsychology, to put it in clinical terms, and ontology, to put it in more philosophical terms, which is far from being self-evident and specifically explored thus far, I would claim. Even more, the potential metapsychological status of anxiety seems to be, at least at first glance, a subject of contestation rather than something one would straightforwardly argue for. It is this contested metapsychological dimension of anxiety, which at the same time figures as a quote-unquote, from Lacan, crucial term of reference, with which I will proceed in order to then reach first its revolutionary articulation, unfolded especially in Lacan's Seminar 10, and second, to its most immediate consequences for his critical ontology. Perhaps one of the main reasons for this missing relationship between anxiety and Lacan's criticism of classical ontology in the literature thus far is his own rather ambiguous position regarding the affects. And I will try to now condense, to cut a long story short, commenting first upon the famous lecture at the steps of the Pantheon, included in the interview between Lacan and the audience at the steps of the Pantheon, which is included as a lesson in his Seminar 17, where Lacan is obviously accused in the spirit of the protest of the May 68 as somebody who totally neglected the problems of the affects. And in his defense, Lacan obviously says, how can I be accused about anything like this? Because I dedicated the whole Seminar 10 to the most important affect in psychoanalysis, which is the affect of anxiety. However, to this defense, he immediately adds something strange, arguing that the affect, as seen by psychoanalysis, is not suppressed, it's that is displaced and unrecognizable. What makes this argument strange in light of affect in general and anxiety in particular is the following. If according to a common understanding, repression equals to the unconscious, so that the psychoanalytic interpretation would aim at kind of unearthing the unconscious repressed content, repressed signifiers, as Lacan stresses on some occasion, the fact that the affect is not repressed and is even displaced and in motion would then make of anxiety an element that exceeds the domain of psychoanalysis, as Adrian, for example, Adrian Johnston, nicely noted this apparent paradox. Seemingly, this is confirmed by taking together Lacan's basic definition of anxiety and the definition of the unconscious. The unconscious is structured as language, the definition running throughout Lacan's work. On the other hand, anxiety is a signal of the real. So the first definition implies that the unconscious functions according to the famous logic of the signifier, that is, symbolic order of language, while the second definition ties anxiety to the concept of the real, which is by definition heterogeneous to the symbolic and indeed marks the limits of the latter. Thus, at first glance, the affect and particularly the affect of anxiety has no immediate relation to the unconscious, which psychoanalysis deals with in the first place. The affect is felt, moreover, is felt by the ego, which locates the affect precisely in the domain of the ego and not to that of the unconscious, which is structured as a language. And accordingly, according to this premise, there should not be any kind of the metapsychology of the affect and far less of anxiety, insofar as the affect seems to belong to the psychological or empirical domain of felt experiences that are only of secondary importance in psychoanalysis as metapsychology. And yet, Lacan insists throughout his seminar that anxiety has a distinguished status not only among other affects, but quite surprisingly, among other concepts of psychoanalysis as well. Such a distinguished status of psychoanalysis is perhaps best epitomized in Lacan's one-liner in his seminar, from his seminar 11, in which he categorically argues that, quote unquote, for analysis, anxiety is a crucial term of reference because in effect, anxiety is that which does not deceive. Counterintuitively, the distinguished status of anxiety is here defined not only by the content of the one-liner itself, namely by Lacan's observation that anxiety is that which does not deceive, but also by the place of enunciation or context in which this one-liner takes place. The place is nothing other than Seminar 11, entitled Four Fundamental Concepts of Psychoanalysis. So the paradox is here brought to the extreme. On the one hand, Lacan dedicated the whole year of Seminar 11 to the articulation of the four fundamental concepts of psychoanalysis: unconscious, repetition, transference, and the death drive, while this, on the other hand, by no means prevented him for assigning the status, quote unquote, again, the crucial term of reference to anxiety, which does not even list to the concept, does not even figure in the list of the four fundamental concepts, of any list of fundamental concepts. You might imagine what is this paradox all about. It's all about that anxiety, on the one hand, is the affect. So its origin, it's an instinctual dimension of the drive, while the concepts, on the other hand, has the symbolic status and can be articulated linguistically and symbolically, while anxiety, on the other hand, marks the very limit, the very frame of the symbolic dimension. So this is why Miller, for example, summarized this paradox traversing the whole Seminar 10 and generally Lacan's take on anxiety and the relation between anxiety and the concept. Either anxiety or the concept, one cannot have them both. So, and referring to the example which is probably the best example that Peter was referring yesterday to. Like there is a passage from anxiety or from the affect to the concept by way of excluding the objectia. The objectia must be, in order to form the fantasy, must be excluded from the frame in order to set up the frame of the fantasy up, and that could be the point of the passage between the affect that is felt on the one hand and the concept of the other. What this disposition evokes is therefore a paradox or the problem of the two forms of displacement that we are dealing with when discussing, for example, the distinction between anxiety on the one hand and the fear or emotions on the other. So as we shall see soon, it is anxiety's position at the limit between symbolic reality and the real of jouissance that explains and resolves the apparent short circuit between anxiety being a crucial terms of reference and an affect that is by definition displaced. And furthermore, this very same structure of anxiety also highlights the way anxiety is displaced, which substantially differs from the way other affects, or better yet, emotions, etymologically referring to the movement, are displaced. What makes the difference between anxiety being one singular affect and other affects or emotions is precisely this different form of displacement, or better yet, the difference in the place where one and the others are displaced. And perhaps this different form of displacement is that specific characteristic which enables Lacan to assign the status of crucial term of reference to anxiety, regardless its non-conceptual status. And moreover, the displacement of the affect, which, as Lacan stresses, is thereby not repressed, is however not unrelated to the broader mechanism of repression, which includes the structural point of primal repression, Urverdrängung. Paradoxically enough, as we shall see soon, this peculiar form of displacement, which is directly related to the whole mechanism of repression, establishes anxiety also as a cornerstone of Lacan's critical ontology. And I'm now moving to the second part of this paper, which I will try to be more specific regarding this ontological structure anxiety is related to. So let me begin by the basic definition of Lacan's unconscious. So for Lacan, the unconscious, rather than referring, like I said, simply to the repressed unconscious content, is instead structured around what he calls a pre-ontological gap or negativity, which, as he puts it, quote unquote, does not lend itself to ontology, precisely because it refers to the point where knowledge and being fail to mutually correspond. As he put it in the famous passage in his Seminar 11, I quote, "The gap of the unconscious may be said to be pre-ontological. I have stressed all too often forgotten characteristics, forgotten in a way that is not without significance, of the first emergence of the unconscious, namely, that it does not lend itself to ontology. Indeed, what became at first apparent to Freud, to the discoverers, to those who made the first steps, and what still becomes apparent to anyone in analysis who spent some time observing what truly belongs to the order of the unconscious, is that it is neither being nor unbeing, but the unrealized." End of quote. What I suggested to calling the third dimension of being at the beginning of this paper, of this presentation, refers precisely to what Lacan points here with the expression the unrealized. This expression points to the peculiar status of the above-mentioned gap of the unconscious, which is conceived not simply as non-being, as he stresses, but should instead be regarded as ontological negativity, which amounts to the, that's most important, to the cause, the structural cause, which is a negative cause due to which the existing reality is essentially structured as the way it is, so as pathological. In order to properly grasp the point of this ontological negativity, it is necessary to further focus on Seminar 11, where Lacan elaborates the Freudian hypothesis of the so-called primal repression, Urverdrängung. Therein, at the point of explaining the quote-unquote necessary fall of one signifier for the emergence of the symbolic order of language, Lacan defines the elements in this operation in the following manner. There is then, one might say, a matter of life and death between the unary signifier, S1, and the subject, qua binary signifier, cause of his disappearance. The Vorstellungsrepräsentanz, ideational representative, is the binary signifier. This signifier constitutes the central point of Urverdrängung, so of primal repression. End of quote. In this passage, Lacan makes it clear that the symbolic order of language constitutes itself as such and starts running according to the logic of the signifier only when, and this is the point Alenka stressed really many times, so only at the point of one signifier gone missing, one signifier less. There has to be the erasure of one signifier to enchain and to produce the order of signifier. This primarily repressed signifier is the real as the place of the emergence of the subject itself, which can be read here simply as a bare erased signifier. Furthermore, the primarily repressed signifier amounts to what Lacan in the essay Science and Truth, but also on many other occasions, conceives as a material cause, which suggests, and this is the term that Lacan uses, the material cause, which suggests that the primary repression of the first signifier is formative for the structure of language as such. In short, it is primary repression that structures the language according to the logic of signifier, so that the unary signifier, that is the point of the subject's unconscious symbolic identity, represents the subject for all other signifiers. If there would be no primary repression, no bare signifier, there would also be no subject to be represented by one signifier for another signifier, to put it really, really simply. The fact that the whole produced by one signifier being erased has consequences and, as Alenka says, for example, determines what gets structured around it, implies that the ontological negativity or deficit at stake amounts not simply to the conditions of possibility, but to the material cause, like I said. As Lacan stresses in his Science and Truth, the psychoanalytic conception of the cause substantially differs from the scientific one insofar as it is, quote unquote, not the cause as logical category, but as causing, causant, the whole effect, end of quote. This is the truth as cause. Again, an expression, a term used by Lacan in the Science and Truth. Specifically, as we have already hinted, the primary outcome of the so-conceived material cause is that the signifying order starts running across the gap of the ontological negativity following the logic of the signifier, producing further effects of metaphor and metonymy, condensation and displacement. The signifier represents the subject for another signifier. Here means literally that the unary signifier functions as a metaphor for the subject. It replaces the subject or starts representing him or herself, himself or herself, well, because it represents the subject for all other signifiers, it makes the subject, as repressed, metonymically contained in the signifying chain and in fantasy as well. The object A in fantasy is but the metonymy or the desire of the subject as a lack of the first signifier. Now, importantly, Freud, in his own articulation of primal repression, does not fail to make it clear enough that the point of the repression of the first signifier is also the point that fixes the drive. And here is a quote from Freud. We have the reason to assume that there is a primal repression, a first phase of repression which consists in the psychical, ideational representative of the drive, the famous psychische Vorstellung Repräsentanz des Tribes, being denied entrance into the conscious. With this, a fixation is established. A representative in question persists unaltered from then onwards, and the drive remains attached to it. End of quote. Now, in this passage, obviously, the greatest attention needs to be paid to the crucial formulation of Freud's, which is basically crucial for psychoanalysis as such. Unlike the understanding, standard understanding, which would be kind of maybe a Foucauldian one, which points to the repression of the drive itself, Freud here clearly says that what is repressed is not the drive itself, but rather its ideational representative or signifier or marker. In this sense, primal repression by no means directly concerns the drive, but rather its representative or signifier as the subject's marker of this representation. Again, an expression from Alenka's interpretation, reading of this concept. Now, moving from this premise, the singularity of the topology of the unconscious is articulated by Lacan soon becomes clear. This topology, in fact, revolves around the whole of primal repression, primary repressed signifier, resulting in a twofold structure. On the one hand, the subject as that which one signifier represents for another signifier, while on the other hand, the drive as to mention the term used by Lacan, introduced by Lacan in Seminar 11, the headless subject, or not yet subject, which circulates as the drive, which circulates around the very same whole. Importantly, here we are in a position to properly grasp the complexity of the displacement of affects as advocated by Lacan. In fact, as Adrian Johnston has already pointed out, in parallel with Freud's twofold repression process, which consists of primal repression and everyday ordinary second stage repression proper, or as Freud puts it, after repression, whereby the latter hits the signifiers that are by association connected with primal repression. At the level of affects, we are also dealing with two senses of displacement. And it's a brief quote from Adrian's text. First, the shuttling of an affect from one signifier-like ideational representative to another, a displacement of affect corresponding to secondary or proper repression. And second, the split between an affect and its non-representative representations introduced with the originary advent of the mediation of signifiers. This mediation amounts to a primal repression of affects through irreversibly displacing them into the foreign territories of symbolic orders, end of quote. However, although at first glance this might imply a neat separation between a primal repressed signifier and affects in general, Johnston himself further stresses that such a neat separation is questionable, to say the least. In fact, while the displacement at stake, on the one hand, transforms the affects in emotions or sentiments, feelings, lies, as something essentially deceptive, this, on the other hand, does not lead to the conclusion about a neat separation between signifiers and affects, and, I would add, far less between the primal repressed signifier and anxiety. Namely, if there is something like l'allonge, that is an enjoyment of blah blah or the other satisfaction, which emerges in the very place or at the very place of the absence of sexual relationship, This then immediately implies a libidinally charged orifices of the mouth when nonsensical sound is vocalized, or ears when it's heard. To borrow again, this is a brief quote from Adrian's text. So, due to the nonsensical sound, the voice as different of speech, traversing the symbolic order of signifiers, the latter are libidinally charged in the same way, or better yet, with the same gesture as the anatomical orifices of the body. There is, for Lacan, common topology of the body and language as far as the subject, qua speaking being, is concerned. And the common topology is a concept, is again an expression he introduces in Seminar 11 to emphasize the knot or the link, the inextricable connection between the anatomical orifices of the body, where inside transforms itself into outside, and the gap of the unconscious, so the gap which amounts to the primal repression. There are at least two highly important implications deriving directly from this observation, both of which concern the relation between anxiety and primal repression. First, if there is something like enjoyment of language, which Lacan advances, especially from Seminar 17 onwards, this, as in the case of enjoyment as such, implies that the existence of the above-mentioned ontological structure, which ultimately causes something like jouissance as different from pleasure, and just want to recall the infamous definition of which kind of a predecessor of Lacan's definition of jouissance as different from pleasure, is precisely from the beyond the pleasure principle, is the pleasure that is not felt as such. So the pleasure that is kind of surplus of pleasure beyond pleasure. So this is why it is traumatic. And second, if anxiety is relieved by phobia, which displaces the affect in the territory of the symbolic network, whereby this network itself runs across the gap of the primal repression or one signifier less, then anxiety emerges precisely in the passage between the two dimensions, that is, in a curved space between the traumatic jouissance we feel and signifying expression as a form of displacement into external mediation, the language, which already implies a kind of domestication and thereby the distortion of anxiety, its transformation, distortion into fear as a known danger, as Freud puts it. In this respect, Colette Soler, for example, was right to argue that unlike all other affects, anxiety is not displaceable, since the form in which anxiety is displaced can be regarded as a very peculiar form of displacement. In fact, anxiety is not displaced into signifiers as other emotions. Instead, it is displaced to the object A, qua the object of the surplus jouissance, which is at the same time the effect of primal repression, since the jouissance emerges in the very place of primal repression as a surplus or excess, and also as its inner otherness of the language itself. In this way, anxiety, as Soler further argues, remains moored in what produces it. So anxiety is improperly or not entirely displaced, since it is displaced onto the object A, through which it remains directly attached to primal repression as the cause of anxiety. Lacan makes this point crystal clear, for example, in Seminar 17, a brief quote: "We can momentarily write down this affect as equal to A, and we can see that we rediscover the same A at the level of the affect." End of quote. Well, if the affect of anxiety is inscribed at the level of the object A, which is conceived as the lack of being, Lacan does not fail to add that what we discover at the level of the effect of the object A is precisely the bare subject, which is precisely the case of contemporary university discourse, in which student's position is, again, quote from seminar 17, in a more or less marked manner identified with this object A, which is charged with producing what? The birds S that comes next on the lower lower right-hand side, so the split subject on the lower level on the right-hand side of the university discourse. So in short, anxiety is displaced by primary repression of the first signifier at the level of the object A, which then produces the bare subject, which in the university discourse figures precisely under the bar at the place of production. Put in more common parlance, if in the modern epoch of university discourse people are reduced to the level of the objects A qua object of surplus jouissance, this produces anxiety that is felt at the level of the bare subject. A subject under the bar means only that society in general tries to repress this objective product of anxiety, reducing anxiety to the level of individual pathology instead of conceiving it as a structural cause. And precisely in this sense, I would argue that anxiety should be conceived as a material and in the same way also as a materialist affect, because it is related directly to the primary repression being the structural cause for the symbolic structure. Importantly, on this point, we should not confound anxiety as a cause of symptom formation with ontological negativity as material cause. So if negativity is the cause of the emergence of the traumatic surplus enjoyment, while anxiety, insofar as it emerges in the moment of the subject's encounter with such a traumatic enjoyment, functions as a signal of subject's encounter with jouissance, as well as the cause of subject separation from jouissance, which then results in his or her entry into dialectics of desire and symptom formation. To put it in a more Freudian parlance, anxiety is a material affect of primary repression and remains attached to it. In this respect, anxiety is an affective product of negativity in the form of a signal, and moreover a two-sided signal, which can signal both the approaching encounter with the real, as well as the moment of the actualization of this very same encounter. As such, anxiety is thus, first of all, signal of the existence of the ontological negativity, which only makes the subject's encounter with the real something traumatic and not simply painful, frustrating, etc. If, according to Miller, the point of psychoanalysis is the, quote, deduction of the dead drive as an embodiment of the ontological negativity, the real as that which insists within the signifying chain, by means of an analytic interpretation of subject symptom, then it is clear why Lacan assigned to anxiety the role of, again, quote-unquote, crucial term of reference. Anxiety is the sole signal or material affect that does not deceive about the success of this deduction insofar as it signals, proves, not simply the grammatical structure on which the drives run, but also the existence of the epiphenomenal or metapsychological dimension of the drive, that is, the ontological negativity, which causes the drive to take the shape of grammatical linguistic oppositions, as well as to its traumatic status. In this respect, anxiety, as a subjective affect, also has a distinctively objective status in psychoanalysis. Thanks so much.
Questions?
I'll go first.
Okay. Okay. Well, thank you, Boštjan. Great, intense paper. I wanted to go back to perhaps the first third of your presentation. Well, actually, no, preliminary remark. I mean, I really liked your formula where you're saying the relationship between ontology and psychoanalysis should be understood in the same way as Lacan understands the relationship between psychoanalysis and science. So the wrong question is psychoanalysis an ontology? The good question is, what is an ontology that accommodates psychoanalysis? So I'll probably steal that from you because I think it's really, really good. So, coming to my point, it's copyright, but no, it's a great formulation. Thank you. So, my question, and also a request for clarification, maybe. You know, so everything you said I follow everything you said, but we have this problem, right? So it seems like either anxiety is an affect or it is a concept. You mentioned that at one point. My straightforward question, then I will try to articulate it, is are you trying to find a way, ontologically, to merge this apparent incompatibility between anxiety as an affect or anxiety as a concept? Are you trying to put them together ontologically, or are you trying to find an ontological way in which, nonetheless, the two are not unrelated, but at the same time not fused? Because my take would be that the challenge, the wager, is precisely to actually overcome, almost dialectically, this apparent tension between anxiety as affect and anxiety as concept. So, you know, obviously as qua affect, anxiety is not without an object, a famous formula you dwelt on. But then as a concept, we have to think of anxiety as a concept without an object. Because it's actually, conceptually, it's the concept of the void.
Exactly.
In a sense.
Yeah.
And then the challenge is to put together these two apparently contradictory, if not in tension, aphorisms. So that's my attempt to actually translate in my own terms what I've been listening to. But then I wanted like a clarification whether we are on the same page. So an ontology of anxiety would be something like the following definition of anxiety. Anxiety is that which is not without an object, qua affect, provided that, qua concept, it is a concept without an object. It's a bit convoluted, but and I'm trying to put together these different pieces of Lacan because in a sense, like, you know, if you go back to seminar 9, so right before seminar 10, there is this whole discussion of different forms of negativity. It's not even set theory there, it's Kant, right? And what Lacan says, like, what is so great in Kant and forgotten is this idea of a negativity where you have a concept without an object, right? So would that suit you? Would that suit your agenda? i.e. putting together anxiety as affect, anxiety as concept through those two bits of Lacan?
To be like brutally honest and without improvising anything, it's a really, really dense and complex question that first needs to be unpacked by. So to properly, I don't have an immediate answer to that. The only thing only two side remarks that are, like I said, are not direct answer to your question. But the first way of conceiving anxiety is obviously, like, this first choice, either anxiety or the concept, well, yeah, derives from, but it's a kind of Millerian recuperation of the way he tries to formulate this distinction between Lacan's take on anxiety, and especially the way he takes on, because he says, like, in Seminar 10, we have a completely new definition of object. He says, in his Lacan in previous phase, took the object A primarily as a kind of signifier. From the, that's Miller's argument. From the Seminar 10 onwards, he provides a kind of new definition of object, which is the object of the drive and the cause of desire, in a sense that is, I would put it, kind of materialization of the void qua something that is missing. And I would say anxiety is an affective signal that remains attached and at the same time gives us the road access. And I would here, like in the second chapter of the book, I deal with also relying on today's reading of the Ratman's case. And the example, the apex of Ratman's case, today was referring to before, the famous storytelling about the story of the punishment is for me a kind of the prototype of the way anxiety functions as a signal of the encounter between the subject and the traumatic jouissance, the dead drive. Because at the same time, he is like somatically expressing enjoyment at the verbal, at the symbolic level. The Ratman starts losing words to describe this immense pressure of the demand of the drive. And so that's one thing I can say, but like I said, it's not an immediate answer to your question. What more complicates this picture is what Lacan says in Seminar 17, where he associates affect, because then he starts speaking, there is only one affect, there is not even a question of anxiety, etc., but tries to provide a kind of singular general theory of the affect related to the object A affecting the subject. And he says the object is almost something like thinking, not being, thinking. So it more comes closer to thinking, and it's a context of Descartes' cogito. And then it's a question, to what extent then cogito should be read, and trying to put forward this kind of reading, to read more as related to the anxiety and the affect than to the relation between being and thinking. Sorry.
Thank you, Boštjan. It was very intense, and you presented many very stimulating things. But apropos this dilemma of affect and concept, I think that it goes back, as you already emphasized, to Kierkegaard, because anxiety for him can be felt or thought. And in a way, it goes back to Heidegger also, you know, because what Heidegger tries to do in his Being and Time is to rewrite Critique of Pure Reason. And instead of basing anything on the Kantian mixture, you know, that intuitions without concepts are blind and concepts without intuitions are empty, he starts with an affect, and this affect is called Stimmung in German language, which for him is anxiety. And in paragraph 40 and then on, you have all his, development through Befindlichkeit, etc., etc. So what is Heidegger, I'm not saying that Lacan is Heideggerian to that point, but certainly there are some very similarities and parallels. But what Heidegger tries to find is to find affects that would somehow...
Sorry, to find?
To find affects that would automatically lead to thinking. So he chooses boredom, wonder, and anxiety, because they are, and he analyzes them. So in a way, he somehow tries to find a basis, a fundamental, for which necessarily somehow or automatically leads to thinking. Now, for him, Stimmung is a very, I don't know, it's a very tricky moment, You cannot, you cannot translate it accordingly to English without losing some of the elements, The traditional translation is attunement, but the earlier version of Being and Time has moods, or mood. So what he's trying to find is to find a foundation. And only once in Being in Time, he somehow introduces the word Grundstimmung, which later, in his lectures from 1929, etc., on boredom, etc., plays a crucial role. So this is just a comment about this dilemma between affect and concept, so in a way. What is also interesting, considering fundamental concepts of psychoanalysis, is that in the Seminar 11, you don't have desire as a fundamental concept, whereas
for example,
in previous 10 seminars, it's a central concept in a way. But it's not a question, it's just a remark. Listening to your explanation of the university discourse, I suddenly realized that students there are not really students, that we are all in the position of the students now in neoliberalism, because we are constantly going to school with all these reforms, and the formation is never really final. You have to do it again and again. So it
sorry I wrote a kind of 10 years ago a bit on the concept of lifelong learning. There is a really crazy definition: a seamless learning from cradle to grave. So yeah, here we are.
Here we are. Just another remark. The gap between Descartes and Kierkegaard also contains some other theories of the affect. For instance, Spinoza, it's the primal thinker of the affect, but here's also a terminological confusion working, because you have passions, you have sentiments,
exactly.
You have Scottish Enlightenment,
No, I'm sorry. I mentioned Spinoza. It's a side remark. I get it how to condense a already long paper.
This is just a remark how certain. And there's also confusion concerning what is an affect. In Kant, affect is something very short, very impulsive, etc. Then again, what is enthusiasm, etc. So, for him, Yeah. So.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Well, thank you, Boštjan, for an incredibly rich and fascinating talk. And when listening to, in particular, the stretch of it in which you point out how you go from Seminar 10 with devoted by its very title to the topic of anxiety, to Seminar 11 with it not featuring as one of the 4 fundamental concepts. I'm wondering, though, if for you, especially in terms of the idea of ontological negativity here, whether you would be in favor of concretizing it in relation to Seminar 11 in terms of, in that seminar, Lacan in particular, when talking about the drive as one of the 4 fundamental concepts, of course, is it pains to emphasize that the Freudian drive is, as Lacan compares it to a surrealist collage or something along the lines of a Rube Goldberg apparatus. And And, you know, this, of course, you know, when you go back to Freud in light of this, you can see it in terms of, for example, the Freud of drives and their vicissitudes, indicating that, well, a drive is itself not a homogeneous entity, not, you know, a single unified thing, but rather is itself a kind of Frankenstein-like composite entity consisting of source, pressure, aim, and object, right? And that, of course, part of Lacan's point is that, well, these four components don't actually work together all that well. I mean, you can, of course, in a Rube Goldberg-like fashion, they can be slapped together and you know, things unfold, but, you know, nonetheless, this is a clunky, internally, you know, prone to tensions or breakdowns, this sort of structure or apparatus. And it would seem as though if, you know, given your presentation here, that in a way it's as though anxiety would show up most readily in terms of the drive's pressure continuing to make itself felt, but once the original object, as, you know, whether a Freudian Vorstellung or a Lacanian signifier, once the drive object, the initial drive object has succumbed to repression, and in this case to primal repression, that the continued registration, even consciously, of that drive's demand for work, as, among other things, a kind of affective excitation, cannot but be consciously felt yet misfelt, not as, for instance, say, sexual excitation in relation to, you know, a now repressed object of that drive, but instead sexual excitation, which when not felt as such, is instead felt as anxiety, as you know, including even at the level of, you know, rapid heart rate, you know, various, you know, somatic, you know, manifestations, et cetera, which are going to be spontaneously misapprehended, even though they're felt, they're going to be misfelt as, well, this is anxiety, this is this free-floating, you know, agitated excitation that doesn't seem to be tied to an object, but of course it's tied to a repressed object, which, were that to be explicitly rendered, you know, conscious, would then perhaps allow for the possibility of this being registered now as, say, sexual excitation rather than anxiety. So it seems as though, at least here, the fundamental negativity would be the lack of full integration or fit between the components of drive, as Freud already outlines it, and that specifically drive pressure, when it is felt but not felt in conjunction with the object that has been primarily repressed, to which that pressure is tied, that would then give you anxiety. But I'm not sure if this would be what you would want, the specific way you would want the model that you're developing here to be understood or interpreted.
Well, really briefly, if I got you right, I think I basically agree with you. The way I would put it is to use the example from Seminar 11, like he says, the object A is not a kind of primordial food that would be taken away from the subject, and the subject would wandering for this missing object. It's the other way around. It's the object A emerges from the fact that no food will once and for all content the subject need for satisfy the demand of the drive. Now, anxiety for me would emerge from time to time when, as a kind of signal that maybe this lack of the object is start itself lacking, so that some object is start emerging and functioning as this spectral phantom of the missing object. So, to some extent, maybe we could put it in that way that if desire, for example, is always, and you know, there is different way of reading the desire's response to the particular empirical object. The response, this is not that. But I would say anxiety emerges precisely when you cannot say, when you say basically not this is not that, but that's it. And so this is the uncanny moment when the subject encounters the object, the lacking object from his fantasy. I would say. So this is the way the lack is lacking. So there is a surplus emerging, not the privation. But on the other hand, I totally agree. The drive is well, if psychoanalysis anything has to teach us, is that the drive is a kind of montage, is a composed structure where you can there is a kind of different combination you can which you can fill these different elements, which are the source, the pressure, etc., etc.
Thanks.
Thank you, Boštjan. Thank you all.
Thank you.